A glimpse at Old Hull. Alderman Symonds, M.R.I.A., of Hull, forwards a paper on the origin of Hull, of which the following is the first part. There is not, perhaps, a place in the kingdom of similar size and importance, much more destitute of ancient architecture, than the town and port of Kyngeston-upon-Hull. Still, we are not altogether in something pauperous in this particular. We have a few examples left of the building styles of days gone by, which the learned body that I have the honour and the pleasure of addressing may deem worthy of inspection. Once upon a time, Hull was described as a pretty city, but it was then, in great part, surrounded by massive castellated and turreted walls and deep and wide moats. Moreover, it was further protected by a very strong though somewhat unpretentious-looking castle, 3 stout blockhouses, and a very scientifically formed citadel. But all this grand mass of architectural construction has vanished. The present generation has witnessed the total destruction of the castle, the citadel, and 2 of the blockhouses, the 3rd blockhouse having been demolished in the first year of the present century. I am not an architect, and therefore you will not expect me to talk like an architect, nor perhaps to think like an architect, and so I must content myself with the little that I have said on the subject of architecture. My present purpose is simply to narrate a few facts illustrative of the town's early history, and to show that Hull was a port of considerable importance before the visit of King Edward I, its reputed founder, in the year of grace 1298, or thereabouts. All the old historians of the town seem to have mistaken the story of its origin. They have it that Hull is not a place of much antiquity, and that it dates only from this good King Edward's time. They tell us that before that period the place consisted of only a few fishermen's and herdsmen's huts. Leyland, who was here in 1538, states in his itinerary that it was, even in the time of the 3rd Edward, but a mean fisher town. The Venerable Camden, trusting to Leyland's authority, repeats the same statement, and Della Prime, Gent, Hadley, and Teakle all follow on the same track in their several histories, and even Gough, in his edition of Camden, reproduces the same old story. In fact, for ages it would be a sort of heresy to question those high authorities, or to depart, in the least, from the accepted tradition. But from the researches of later writers we now know that long before the time of the 1st Edward, the site of the most ancient portion of Hull was occupied as a place of mercantile importance, and that Wyke and Myton were the names of 2 villes or towns, which subsequently became merged into Kyngeston-upon-Hull. It is not improbable that the ground on which that part of Hull now stands, which we commonly designate the Old Town, may have had on it folds, pens, and wash pits, and every necessary convenience for a large sheep farm, when King Edward first became enamoured with the situation of the place. But that is no proof that there was not to the westward, at Myton-Wyke, or Wyke-Myton, where the ancient course of the river Hull flowed, a large number of inhabitants. That such was the case we shall see anon. Myton was an ancient manor, and is mentioned in the Domesday record, and Wyke, the harbour, was doubtless a parcel or member of the Manor of Myton. Wyke was the most populous of the 2 places. Both belonged to the parish of Hessle. The earliest document relating to Wyke is a grant or charter, without date, made to the monks of Meaux, or Melser in Holderness, by Maud or Matilda, daughter of Hugh de Oman. This ancient and most interesting instrument, brackets, the date of which is supposed to be about 1160, which is preserved amongst the muniments of the Corporation of Hull, is addressed to all the sons of Holy Mother Church, as well present as to come, and sets forth that she, the said Maud de Camin, demised and sold to the monks of Melser for 411 marks of silver the entire 2 parts of the lands of her patrimony of Wyke-Myton. The deed states that the patrimony of the aforesaid Ville of Myton consisted of 7 stangs and 4 ox gangs of land, pasture for 800 sheep, the toft in which the hall was situate, the bed of 1 fishery in the Humber, and 2 parts of the salt pits of her fee, certain other torts and crofts possibly, with all other the appurtenances within the Ville and without. And she grants and, by testimony of the present deed, possibly contains, to the Church of Meaux, that all the aforesaid premises shall be held of her and her heirs in perpetual arms, free from all earthly service, and that all the premises shall be holden and warranted against all men to the use of the Church of Meaux and the monks there serving God, as freely as she, the donor, for in reality this is a deed of gift or endowment, or any of her ancestors, at any time freely held the same, in meadows, in pastures, in fields, in waters, in ways, in paths, and in all other easements within the Ville or without. As in the instance of this grant, Wyke and Myton are in old writings frequently written in conjunction, and in other cases separately. As a corroboration of this, Pope Alexander III, in a bull dated 3rd June 1172, mentions Grange of Myton with its appurtenances, without alluding to Wyke, and we learn from the Book of Meaux, Abbey, that Richard, the 10th abbot, in the year 1270, gave half an acre of land in Wyke-Myton to the Canons of Watton Abbey in exchange for 2 tofts in Cronswick and 3 tofts in North Dalton. In the opinion of a learned writer, the villa or town of Myton was situated to the westward of Old River Hull, a very short distance from the bank, and the hamlet of Wyke was built on the shore of the Humber, occupying both sides of the mouth of the Hull, although the principal part lay to the east. Thus Wyke was in 2 separate wapentakes. It follows then, he concludes, that Myton and Wyke were contiguous, and ultimately blended with each other, and together constituted the one town of Hull, lying within the parochial jurisdiction of Hessle in all matters ecclesiastical and civil. With this opinion I am in perfect accord. Besides Maud de Camin's grant of lands in Wyke-Myton to the monks of Meaux about the year 1160, the Chartillery of the Abbey informs us that in the time of Philip, the abbot, John of Meaux, granted to the monks 4 ox gangs of land in Myton, pasture for 400 sheep, the seat of 1 fishery in the Humber, 2 parts of the salt pits there, a toft and a hall, 2 parts of his lands in Wyke, and all their appurtenances, and that William de Sutton and Bennet de Sculcourts gave them the remaining part of Wyke, both within and beyond the bank as far as the midstream of the Old Hull. This ancient outlet of the river is described as having divided the wapentakes of Harthill and Holderness. Thus we find the Abbey of Meaux in possession of the ground upon which is now seated the important town of Kyngeston-upon-Hull. It is right to state that the abbot Philip, just mentioned, ruled the monks of Meaux from 1160 to 1182. He was the 2nd abbot of Meaux. The growth of Wyke-Myton must have been rapid, for, on the authority of William de Aton and others, the commerce of the place in 1204-5, the 6th king of John, actually exceeded all the ports of the kingdom, exempting London, Boston, Southampton, Lincoln and Lynn. You will please to bear in mind that de Rotam's return was made 90 years before King Edward I obtained possession of the place. This is an indisputable proof that Hull was a port of considerable magnitude in the beginning of the 13th century. In many ancient documents we find that for the Wyke or harbour, for that is the meaning of the Saxon word wick or Wyke, the name of the river itself is frequently substituted. For instance, in the Book of Meaux Abbey the town is distinguished by the name of Hull at the very beginning of the reign of Henry II, and in the time of his successor, and there is, as I stated, an abundance of records to prove that it was occasionally so denominated in every reign, down to the period when King Edward conferred upon it a royal designation. Previous to the reign of Henry I, surnames were not in use. People of consequence took their names from the towns which they inhabited. The Book of Meaux tells us that in 1160 a croit in Sutton formerly belonged to Henricus de Hull, Filius Rogeri de Hull, and Agnes, Filia Torrestani de Hull, appear in the list of benefactors to the Abbey. The Great Roll of the Pipe of 48th Henry III mentions Stephen de Hull and Thomas de Hull. I have met with the names of John de Wyke, Simon de Wyke, Stephen son of Robert de Wyke, Stephen de Myton, and Sella de Myton. I have seen some names with two appellations, which must have derived from their birthplace or the town they came from. For instance, I have read about Rafe de Taverner de Nottingham, de Kyngeston-super-Hull, Robert de Sutton, de Kyngeston-super-Hull, and so on. Hull is likewise named as a town in the year 1217, in a demise of Sayer de Sutton, to the abbot and canons of Thornton in Lincolnshire, of common pasture in Sutton, Hull, Schoolcourts, and unreadable, with free ingress and egress between Hull and Will Fleet, whilst the Lady Joanna de Stotevil's men of Hull are mentioned in an agreement made between her and Archbishop Gifford in 1267. It was called Hull, doubtless, from the port or river upon which its commerce was conducted. The ancient baronial family of Etton, or Etton, had considerable property in Hull, Trippett, and Myton, even so far back as the prelacy of Walter Gifford, who died in 1279. Sir Gilbert de Aton was summoned to Parliament from 17th Edward II to 1st Edward III, in which year he died. He had a mansion in High Street, Hull, in 1315, situate between the houses of Robert de Dripol, de Kyngeston-super-Hull, and Adam Heleward. This house was called Aton Hall, and Chapel Lane in this locality was anciently known as Alton Lane. This lane is mentioned in an original deed in the possession of the corporation dated 15th Richard II as Chapel Lane dudu vocat, Aton Lane. Numerous proofs might be adduced that Hull, under its several names, was anything but a mean fishing village, not only when King Edward I saw it, but for more than a century previous. In the year 1204 the monks of Meaux, or Meaux, in some unexplained manner became responsible for the destruction of a chapel in the lordship of Myton, and for this they had to make atonement to Richard Ducket, the parson of Hessle. In fact, they had to rebuild the structure. Now this edifice was a chapel of ease to the Parish Church at Hessle, and if there had not been a considerable amount of population at Myton at and before the year 1204, there would have been no necessity for providing an additional place of public worship in the parish. This must have been a place of importance and consideration before Edward I rechristened it, for we find 1278 the abbot of Meaux praying the king to allow a market on Thursday in each week at Wyke or Wyke near Mitton upon the Hull, and an annual fair at the same place on the vigil, the day and the morrow of the Holy Trinity, and on the 12 following days. This is a most remarkable proof of the importance of Wyke or Hull, for Wyke and Hull are identical at so early a date. Here we have the reputed founder of the place, that monarch to whom is ascribed its origin in 1298, granting to it under another name a market and fair 20 years previously. If Wyke or Myton-Wyke was a place of but little consequence, a mean fisher's village, why grant to it a weekly market and a 15 days yearly fair in 1278? The reason is obvious. The port could not have been a mean fishing village up to the reign of Edward I, for an Aula, or Moty-Hall, is mentioned in the charter of Maud de Camin, where formerly the Manor Courts were held. In 1298 the property of the Abbey of Meaux at Wyke was let at £78 14 shillings and sixpence per annum, whilst the Manor of Myton was worth only £24 8 shillings per annum. These amounts, which were considered large in those days, will give some idea that Wyke was an important place before Edward became possessed of it, keeping in remembrance that the monks were not the sole proprietors of the place, for at that period the family of Sutton, the Canons of Watton Abbey and the Archbishop of York had property in it. The town of Wyke, Myton-Wyke or Hull, must have extended to the site of the present old town before the visit of Edward I, for we find that the Church of the Holy Trinity was founded in 1285 as a sort of chapel of ease to the Parish Church at Hessle. One more proof that Wyke, or Wick, was not exactly a mean village inhabited by fishers only, before the time of Edward I, and I have done with this part of my subject. In the year 1289, that is 7 years before Edward gazed upon the place for the first time, Robert de Scardeburg, Dean of York, founded a monastery for Carmelite or White Friars at Wyke upon Hull. Religious institutions of that kind were not usually established in the mean villages of fishermen and herdsmen. 18 years later, in 1307, Edward obtained permission of the Pope to transfer these friars to a site which he had allotted for them in his new town of Kyngeston-upon-Hull. And why this transfer of the friars? Because their establishment at the old town of Wyke had been found insufficient for the accommodation of the multitudes who flocked thither to divine service. Hence the conclusion is forced upon us that Myton-Wyke, or Wyke-Myton, or Hull, was a populous district long before King Edward saw it, and also that the several names of Myton-Wyke and Hull, written separately or conjunctively, were but different designations for one and the same place, just as in modern times Kyngeston-upon-Hull consisted and continues to consist of 3 places, one separate but neighbouring villages, namely Hull, Sculcoats and Dripol. Here we arrive at an important point in our historic glimpse, and the question arises, how came Edward I to visit this place, and how came the Manor of Myton into his possession? The story is soon told, that is, if the historians of the town are to obtain reliance. In the year 1296, the Scots having made an inroad into England, that warlike and politic monarch marched against them with a brave and well-appointed army, and joining in battle he slew 28,000 of the enemy in the field, and put the rest to flight. Returning through Yorkshire, the historians tell us that he paid a visit of a few days to Lord Wake of Baynard Castle, Cottingham, that whilst hunting one day with several nobles he found himself at the harbour of Wyke-upon-Hull, and was very much charmed with the scene. He viewed with delight, say the historians, the advantageous situation of the place, and foresaw it might become subservient to render the kingdom more secure against foreign invasion, and at the same time greatly augment its commerce. He then, we are told, quickly conceived a thought, worthy of himself, which was to erect here a fortified town, and make a better and more commodious harbour. The book Chartulary, or History of the Abbey of Meaux or Meaux, relates the manner in which this victorious and renowned monarch obtained possession of the property of the monks at Myton and Wyke, in the beginning of the year 1298. In exchange for lands in Lincolnshire, Edward became absolute owner of the place. Having thus succeeded in his design, he issued a proclamation offering great freedom, privileges and immunities to whoever pleased to build and inhabit these, he dignified, the place within the appellation of Kyngeston, or the King's Town, adding the terms upon Hull, to distinguish it from Kyngeston-upon-Thames, and having conferred upon it this royal title, he constituted it a manor independent of Myton, placed the town under the government of a warden and bailiffs, and granted it a charter in 1299. Thus was Kyngeston-upon-Hull founded, and its inhabitants made free burgesses. A handsome new town was presently erected, a new and more commodious harbour was formed on its east side, by widening and deepening a great creek which Sayer, Lord of Sutton, had made for the drainage of his marshes, the old outlet of the river on the western side having warped up, and in a few years the place abounded with merchants, tradesmen, and shipping. Numbers of the principal merchants from neighbouring towns such as Hedden, Pattrington, Ravenspurn, and Barton removed to the new royal borough on the Hull and Humber, and those old and once flourishing ports, being thus deprived of their trade, gradually decayed, and at the present day exhibit but gloomy vestiges of their ancient importance. So quickly did the population and commerce of the newly created borough progress, that in about 60 years from its foundation, in 1359, the port was called upon to furnish King Edward III with 16 ships and 466 men for his intended invasion of France, whilst 25 ships and 662 men was the whole complement furnished by London, and 17 ships and 314 seamen was the number for Newcastle. This shows the rank which Hull had attained in the list of maritime towns at that early period, and it is worthy of note that whilst the majority of the ancient ports in the kingdom have dwindled or continued in their original insignificant positions, Kyngeston-upon-Hull has grown into and has held its position as the third, if not the second, port in Great Britain. In 1322, the 15th of Edward II, the town was fortified with castellated walls and towers and a deep moat, at the cost of the inhabitants. Thus, in as narrow a compass as possible, I have attempted to give you a glimpse at the origin of Hull, a brief sketch of the rise and progress of the place. The old river Hull on the west side of the town, which had its outlet to the Humber at what was long known as the Limekiln Creek, and on the banks of which stood the ancient village or town of Wyke, was certainly the cradle of its commerce, and the patronage and privileges granted to it by that renowned monarch, termed or surnamed by old writers Edward Longshanks, together with the diligence and industry of its inhabitants, has enabled it to rise, by swift bounds, to a glorious maturity. Her beginning was weak and slow, but as time elapsed, her fine series of works for mercantile marine traffic quickened her growth, and the borough at present contains about 180,000 inhabitants. I think that all will agree with me that sufficient proofs have been adduced to show that Hull, under its ancient name of Wyke, was a place of considerable commercial importance, not a mean fishing village, before the visit of its royal refounder, and the names of its ancient merchant magnates and their unbounded charities, which may be read in the history of the town, prove that the commerce of the port is of long standing. Hull is at present one of the very finest ports in the kingdom. It possesses a greater coasting trade than any of our other ports, London excepted. It is particularly well situated for the Baltic, the Hamburg, the Dutch, and the Danish trades. Our trade has gradually extended itself on all sides, and by water carriage alone, hundreds of thousands of our people are maintained. The number of fine ships and splendid steam vessels that resort to the port is very large, and the tonnage of the port is enormous. Every facility for the encouragement of traffic, both by land and sea, is at hand, and I am proud to say that we are extending those facilities. Great in these matters as we undoubtedly are, we have long felt the necessity for increased railway accommodation. That has been a defect in our system, but that defect is now being remedied. How much some ports have declined through diverting railway traffic and by shortening distance between the coal and manufacturing districts, how some ports such as Grimsby and Hartlepool have raised themselves. I have boundless faith in the future of this, my native town. I believe that by a wise and well-regulated local government, such as will promote spirited improvements, as the present powers that be seem determined to do, that the inhabitants will become a great and powerful people, and that the fine old port, with its vast advantages, will be ranked second to none, excepting, perhaps, the metropolis, in the list of the greatest emporiums of our mighty sovereignty.